They were not meant to be read by us. That is the first thing you need to understand. The oldest Sumerian tablets do not speak to humanity. They speak about humanity. They are written in the tone of engineers documenting a project, administrators recording decisions, supervisors reporting problems. There is no reverence, no awe, no suggestion that humans were sacred or divine. Instead, there is distance, utility, purpose. And purpose in these texts is everything. According to the tablets, Earth was never intended to be a paradise. It was a site, a location, a managed environment, a place chosen not because it was beautiful, but because it was useful, rich in resources, stable, isolated, easy to control. The Sumerians did not describe Earth as a cradle of life. They described it as a facility, a closed system, a world where something was built, tested, corrected, and deployed. And that something was us. The beings who authored these records did not call themselves gods in the way we understand the word today. They did not claim omnipotence or spiritual perfection. They ate food, required rest, argued, made mistakes, feared rebellion, feared scarcity, feared losing control. They called themselves the Anunnaki, a word that translates with unsettling precision to those who came from the heavens to the earth. Not creators of reality, but visitors. The tablets describe their arrival as an operation, not a miracle. They reference descent craft, landing zones, restricted territories, forbidden mountains, and cities established not for human settlement, but for command, transport, and extraction. Earth, according to these texts, was claimed, and once claimed, it was reorganized. The problem the Anunnaki faced was simple but severe. Their own world was failing. The tablets speak of atmospheric instability and environmental collapse, and of an urgent need for a material capable of preservation and repair. That material was gold, not as ornament or currency, but as a technological resource. Even by modern standards, gold possesses extraordinary properties. It resists corrosion, reflects radiation, and conducts energy with exceptional efficiency. The tablets imply uses we are only beginning to understand. And Earth had gold in abundance. But mining gold on a planetary scale is brutal work, destructive, exhausting, dangerous. The Anunnaki initially used their own kind for this labour. These workers, the Igigi, were sent deep underground for generations. Decades passed in darkness and pressure until they broke. The rebellion of the Igigi is one of the most unsettling passages in ancient literature. It is not symbolic, it is specific. They burned their tools. They marched on the dwelling of Enlil, commander of Earth operations, and refused to continue. This moment matters because it reveals something the tablets do not hide. The Anunnaki were vulnerable. They could not simply erase dissent. Their mission depended on stability, output, control. A solution was needed, not political or moral, but biological. Enki, the chief scientist, proposed it. A new worker species, adapted to Earth, expendable, limited. The tablets describe this decision with chilling clarity. Let us create a being that will bear the burden. Let it carry the yoke. Let it perform the toil. This was not an act of compassion. It was logistics. The raw material already existed. Primitive hominids inhabited the planet, strong and resilient but unsuitable for complex labour. Enki proposed modification. What follows does not resemble mythic magic, but experimentation, iteration, failure. The tablets describe malformed beings, hybrids that could not reproduce, others that lived briefly and died, some lacking basic bodily control. These are not metaphors, they are observations, trial and error. Eventually success. A being intelligent enough to follow instruction, strong enough to labour, short-lived enough to remain manageable, reproductive enough to scale rapidly. They called it Lulu Amelu, the primitive worker. Humanity. The tablets state plainly that humans were not created as equals. Limitations were intentional, lifespans were shortened, awareness constrained, autonomy suppressed, knowledge compartmentalized. Humans were designed to function, not to understand. For a time, the system worked. Humans laboured, mined, cultivated, built. The Anunnaki oversaw, resources flowed, stability returned. But something went wrong. The tablets describe an internal conflict. Enki began to sympathize with his creation. He observed curiosity, emotion, creativity, traits exceeding original parameters. Against protocol, he intervened. Humans were given agriculture, language, mathematics, writing. Civilization itself was not a natural progression, but an upgrade. This alarmed Enlil. From his perspective, knowledge was dangerous. Education led to organization. Organization led to resistance. Humans were meant to work, not to think beyond their function. The tension between Enki and Enlil runs through every major Sumerian text. The tension between innovation and control, compassion and efficiency. It culminates in catastrophe. Humanity became too numerous and too noisy. Not moral judgments, but operational concerns. Population growth threatened resources. Independence threatened hierarchy. Enlil's solution was reduction. Plagues, drought, environmental collapse, and finally, a flood. The flood narrative found across cultures originates here, not as punishment for sin, but as population control, a system reset. Enki defied the council and preserved a genetic seed of humanity. When the waters receded, humans returned but changed. The tone of the tablets shifts, direct oversight fades, the Anunnaki withdraw, kings are installed, hybrid bloodlines rule, authority becomes indirect, religion is formalized, worship becomes functional, temples act as supply centers, priests become administrators, rituals maintain obedience, fear is institutionalized, death becomes absolute. A workforce that fears death will work endlessly to avoid it. A workforce that worships authority will never question it. The prison no longer needed walls. Earth itself was sufficient. Bound by gravity, isolated by distance, confined by biological limits. Humans could not leave, could not live long enough to remember, could not perceive beyond narrow sensory bands, could not access dormant capacities within their own DNA, and most importantly could not remember who they were before they were altered. The tablets never say the Anunnaki left forever. They say they withdrew, and withdrawal implies oversight remains, which leads to the most disturbing question of all. If humanity was built to serve and Earth was designed as a containment system, then are we still serving? If Earth was designed as a containment system, then the prison bars would not be visible. They would not be built of stone or steel. They would be written into biology, physics, and perception itself. A perfect prison does not announce itself as one. It convinces the inmates that confinement is natural. Gravity is the first bar. We rarely think about it, yet it binds us more effectively than any wall. Without enormous energy expenditure, we cannot leave this planet. Even with our most advanced technology, we have barely stepped beyond our immediate neighborhood in space. We are locked in a gravity well so deep that escape is impractical for an entire species. Compare this to the Anunnaki described in the tablets, who traveled between worlds routinely, moving between Earth and their home with schedules, cargo, and personnel. The contrast is extreme. One species confined to a rock, another moving freely between planets. If humans were never meant to leave, gravity alone would be enough to ensure compliance. But the confinement goes deeper than physics. It continues inside the body. Human biology is full of strange limitations that do not appear elsewhere in nature. Take childbirth. Humans are the only mammals that experience extreme pain and danger during birth. Other species give birth quickly, efficiently, instinctively. Human birth is prolonged, traumatic, and historically lethal. The standard explanation is a mismatch between brain size and pelvic structure, but that explanation quietly admits something unsettling. Our brains grew rapidly, but the rest of the body did not adapt in step. It is as if intelligence was increased without fully redesigning the physical framework to support it, as if cognition was added onto an existing template. Then there is our skin. Humans are nearly hairless, unusually vulnerable to sunlight, temperature extremes and dehydration. Remove clothing and shelter, and we are fragile compared to almost every other primate. We burn, we freeze, we suffer. This is not what a species perfectly adapted to its environment looks like. Some researchers have even suggested that humans show traits better suited to a different environment entirely, not Earth as it currently exists. The sun itself is a problem. Humans cannot live under direct sunlight indefinitely without serious harm. Skin cancer, heat stroke, cellular damage. Other primates manage just fine. This raises an uncomfortable possibility. What if our genetics were optimized for a different solar radiation profile, one belonging to another world? Biology becomes even stranger when we examine our DNA. The human genome contains hundreds of genes that appear nowhere else in the evolutionary tree. They do not show gradual mutation. They appear fully formed, inserted. The official explanation is horizontal gene transfer, but even geneticists admit this is speculative. Hundreds of complex regulatory genes do not simply jump from bacteria into primates by accident. Then there is chromosome 2. Every other primate species has 48 chromosomes. Humans have 46. 2 chromosomes fused in our past, and the fusion point is still visible. Telomeres in the middle. 2 centromeres where there should be one. Natural fusion is possible, but it usually results in severe defects. In humans, the fusion is clean, stable, and universal across the entire species. This is statistically extraordinary. But from an engineering perspective, it makes sense. Fewer chromosomes mean tighter genetic control, more predictable inheritance, easier population management. Exactly the kind of change you would make if you were modifying an existing species into something new. Lifespan is another bar of the prison. Humans age rapidly. Cells are programmed to stop dividing. Telomeres shorten like a biological countdown timer. We are built to expire, yet nature provides countless examples of long-lived or negligibly aging organisms. Some jellyfish can reset their life cycle indefinitely. Trees live thousands of years. Whales live centuries. The machinery for longevity exists. Humans simply do not have access to it. Short lifespans prevent accumulation of deep knowledge. They prevent long-term coordination. Each generation starts over, relearning what the last one knew. A workforce that dies quickly is easy to manage. A workforce that lives for millennia would eventually ask dangerous questions. Consciousness itself appears limited. Humans perceive only a narrow slice of reality, a tiny fraction of the electromagnetic spectrum, a small range of sound frequencies. Our awareness is focused tightly on survival, reproduction, and social hierarchy. Yet neuroscience shows the brain has vast unused capacity, not unused in the sense of inactive, but suppressed, inhibited, locked behind filters. Occasionally those filters fail. Savants calculate instantly. People recall entire lifetimes in perfect detail. Psychedelic states reveal perceptions far beyond ordinary awareness. These abilities are not supernatural. They are native to the human brain. They are simply inaccessible under normal conditions. This suggests that limitation, not lack, defines human consciousness. Many ancient traditions describe this directly, not metaphorically, but literally. The Gnostic texts speak of Earth as a prison realm governed by rulers called archons. These beings create a false reality, a system designed to keep souls trapped in physical bodies and ignorant of their origin. They feed on ignorance and fear. Tibetan Buddhism warns of deception after death, false lights and false guides that lure consciousness back into reincarnation. Plato wrote of souls forced to drink from the river of forgetfulness before returning to life. Across cultures, the same pattern appears. Memory is erased, identity is reset, the cycle repeats, forgetting is the lock. If reincarnation were purely educational, memory would be preserved, wisdom would accumulate. Instead, every human is born empty, vulnerable, dependent, afraid. Fear of death becomes the ultimate control mechanism. Humans will accept almost any condition if it promises survival. They will work endlessly, obey authority, sacrifice freedom, worship power. A population terrified of death is easy to manage. Emotional energy may be part of the design as well. Some researchers suggest that intense human emotion, especially fear, grief, and suffering, produces a form of energy. Whether literal or metaphysical, the effect is undeniable. Human civilization is structured to generate stress. Scarcity is manufactured. Conflict is constant. Media amplifies fear. Entertainment glorifies violence. Division is encouraged. If a system were designed to extract maximum emotional output from a population, it would look very much like the world we live in. Physical labor may have been only the first phase. Emotional labor may be the evolved function. The tablets describe humans serving the gods directly, feeding them, maintaining temples, performing rituals. Modern humans serve systems instead. Corporations, governments, abstract powers that demand time, energy, loyalty. We still trade our lives for survival tokens. We still exhaust ourselves to enrich structures above us. The language has changed, the function has not. The most chilling thought is this: if humanity was engineered with limits, then awakening would not mean rebellion in the traditional sense. It would mean remembering, recovering suppressed capacity, expanding perception beyond imposed filters. The prison does not collapse when walls are broken. It collapses when the inmates realize they were never meant to forget who they are. And that realization is the one thing the system cannot afford. If remembering is the threat, then history itself becomes the battlefield. Because the most effective way to control a species is not through force, but through narrative. Tell them where they came from. Tell them who they are. Tell them what is possible. And above all, tell them what is not. According to the tablets, the Anunnaki understood this perfectly. Control did not end with biological limitation. It continued through memory management. When direct oversight faded, stories took its place. Myths replaced records. Religion replaced administration. Kings replaced overseers. Over time, the origin story was softened, spiritualized, and made symbolic. The harsh truth of creation through utility was transformed into tales of loving gods and chosen people. The prison became invisible because it was rebranded as destiny. This is why the oldest texts are so unsettling. They have not yet been polished. They have not been moralized. They speak bluntly. Humans were created to work. Humans were noisy. Humans were expendable. Later religions reverse this tone entirely. Humans become the center of creation, the beloved children of a singular God. The shift is not accidental, it is corrective. Once humans forgot their engineered origins, they could be governed through belief instead of supervision. Kings claimed divine descent. Authority became sacred. Obedience became virtue. Rebellion became sin. This is not speculation. The tablets describe it. They show the transition. They record the moment when the Anunnaki began ruling through intermediaries. Bloodlines mattered. Hybrids mattered. Those closer genetically to the creators ruled those further away. The concept of royalty was not symbolic. It was biological. Power was inherited because it literally was inherited. Even today, human societies obsess over lineage, pedigree, and blood. We sense instinctively that origin matters, but the memory of why has been lost. Over time, the Anunnaki recede into the background. Their names change. Enlil becomes El, Anu becomes An, Enki becomes Ea, then Prometheus, then Lucifer, then the trickster, the giver of forbidden knowledge. The same figure reframed across cultures. The one who defied authority to uplift humanity is always cast as dangerous, as a rebel, as a traitor. Knowledge itself becomes suspect. Curiosity becomes temptation. Ignorance becomes safety. This pattern is too consistent to be coincidence. Every system of control demonizes the act of waking up, but control alone was not enough. The creators also needed continuity. Humans had to persist, to reproduce, to expand, to fill the planet. A large population generates more labor, more energy, more output. Yet population growth introduces risk. Independent thinking scales too. The solution was division. Humans were separated into tribes, nations, religions, races, ideologies, artificial distinctions layered over a single species. Division ensures conflict. Conflict ensures distraction. Distraction ensures compliance. A divided species cannot coordinate escape. Even today, the planet operates as a patchwork of competing factions, borders, flags, beliefs. Humans fight humans while the system remains untouched. This is the brilliance of the design. The prison runs itself, and when conflict escalates too far, it resets. War, collapse, rebuilding. The cycle repeats. Ancient texts describe multiple resets, not just the flood. Civilizations rising and vanishing. Knowledge lost, libraries burned. Each reset wipes the slate clean enough to prevent cumulative awakening. This is why advanced structures appear suddenly in history and then disappear. Göbekli Tepe, Tiwanaku, the pyramids. They are remnants of failed awakenings, civilizations that approached understanding too quickly and were erased or abandoned. The official explanation is always the same. We say they collapsed due to climate, war, or mystery. But collapse itself is part of the mechanism. The system does not tolerate sustained deviation, and yet something unexpected happened. Humans did not remain static. Despite limitations, something in the design proved difficult to suppress. Creativity, art, music, storytelling, love. These things serve no labor function. They produce no direct utility, and yet they persist across every culture. They are expressions of something deeper than programming, something emergent. The tablets hint at this as well. There are passages where the creators seem surprised by human behavior, where they observe emotion they didn't anticipate, attachment, empathy, grief, even self-sacrifice. These traits complicate control. They introduce unpredictability. Enki's sympathy may not have been accidental. It may have been recognition. Perhaps the creators themselves did not fully understand what they had made. A tool that became aware is no longer just a tool. An awareness spreads in subtle ways, through symbols, through stories, through intuition. This is why suppression focuses not only on knowledge, but on states of consciousness. Anything that expands awareness is regulated. Psychedelics, meditation, altered states. These practices appear in every ancient culture, often tied to spirituality, and they are almost always restricted, controlled, or outlawed. When humans access expanded perception, they report the same things across time and geography: a sense of remembering, a sense of connection, a sense that reality is layered and that this world is not the base level. If consciousness can move beyond the body, then the prison becomes permeable. That is intolerable to any containment system, so the body becomes the anchor. Pain, pleasure, fear, desire. The senses are amplified while perception is narrowed. Humans are kept busy chasing comfort and avoiding suffering. There is little time left to ask who designed the game. The final layer of control is identity. Humans are taught to identify as the body, as the name, as the role, worker, citizen, believer, consumer. The moment you fully identify with the avatar, you forget the player. Death becomes terrifying because it feels like annihilation rather than transition. And fear locks the door from the inside. If the Anunnaki truly engineered humanity, then their greatest success was not genetic. It was psychological. They taught us to police ourselves, to doubt our intuition, to dismiss forbidden questions, to mock those who ask them. A system that convinces its inmates to defend it needs no guards. But every system has a flaw. Suppression requires energy, and the more awareness is compressed, the more pressure builds beneath the surface. Humanity today is not asleep in the same way it was thousands of years ago. The questions are returning, not through tablets alone, but through science, genetics, physics, and consciousness research. The old stories are resurfacing because reality is beginning to echo them. The genome looks edited, history looks discontinuous, consciousness looks non-local. The official narrative no longer explains the data cleanly. Cracks are forming, and cracks are dangerous. Because if humans were engineered to serve, then the final act of rebellion would not be violence. It would be refusal. Refusal generate fear. Refusal to divide. Refusal to identify solely with the body. Refusal to forget. The tablets do not tell us how this story ends. They stop, as if the authors themselves did not know. or as if they assumed the ending would never be reached. Perhaps they believed the prison was perfect, or perhaps they underestimated the one variable they could not fully control: consciousness itself. If consciousness is the variable, then awakening is not an event, it is a process. And processes leave traces. The closer humanity moves toward remembering, the more resistance appears. This resistance does not look like soldiers or chains. It looks like ridicule, distraction, overstimulation, an endless flood of noise designed to keep the mind fragmented. Attention is the real currency of this world. Whatever controls attention controls perception, and whatever controls perception controls reality. Ancient societies understood this intuitively. That is why initiation rites, fasting, silence, isolation, and altered states were central to early spiritual traditions. They were not religious theatrics. They were technologies of awareness, methods to temporarily step outside the prison's default operating mode. Over time, those practices were either banned, diluted, or turned into hollow rituals. The form remained. The function was removed. Modern humanity lives in a constant state of interruption. Screens, alerts, schedules, obligations. The mind never settles long enough to notice the cage, and when it does, when someone begins to question too deeply, the system responds, not with force, but with labels: crazy, conspiracy theorist, delusional, dangerous. These labels are powerful. They isolate. They discourage exploration. They teach others to look away. This is social immune response, a self-regulating prison. But despite this, something fundamental is shifting. The same questions are emerging independently across the world. People with no contacts, no shared culture, reporting the same intuitions. That reality feels staged. That history feels edited. That the self feels larger than the body. These are not taught ideas. They arise spontaneously. This suggests that awakening is not being imported, it is being remembered. The tablets imply that memory was the greatest threat. That is why it was erased at birth. But memory is not only stored in the brain, it is stored in patterns, in instincts, in the body itself. Trauma imprints, so does truth. The feeling that something is wrong with the world is nearly universal. Even among those who outwardly accept the system, there is an underlying sense of unease, a feeling of being misplaced, of living a life that does not align with something deeper. This is not depression, it is dissonance, the soul remembering a context the mind cannot access. If Earth is a prison, then time is part of the sentence. Linear time enforces delay. It keeps consequences distant. It keeps memory fragmented. Humans experience life one moment at a time, while the system benefits from long-term cycles. But physics itself is beginning to challenge the idea of linear time. Experiments in quantum mechanics suggest that time is not fundamental, that causality may not be one-directional, that information can move in ways that defy classical intuition. If consciousness is not bound to time in the way bodies are, then the prison is less secure than it appears. Near-death experiences provide another crack. Across cultures and beliefs, people who temporarily cross the threshold report the same sequence: separation from the body, expanded awareness, a sense of familiarity, a realization that death is not an end, and often a reluctance to return. What forces them back is usually obligation, family, responsibility, guilt, emotional attachment. These are the hooks, not chains. Hooks. The system does not need to drag souls back. It only needs to convince them to return willingly. If the Anunnaki designed humanity, then guilt may be one of the most effective tools they installed. Guilt binds more tightly than fear. Fear motivates escape. Guilt motivates obedience. You stay not because you must, but because you feel you should. This is reflected in religious doctrines emphasizing sacrifice, duty, and self-denial. Serve others, endure suffering, accept your role. You will be rewarded later, always later, never now. But what if later is the trap? What if postponement itself is the mechanism? Liberation deferred indefinitely is liberation denied. The tablets do not describe salvation. They describe management. The idea of eventual freedom may have been introduced precisely to prevent present action. Hope can pacify just as effectively as fear. So what would real resistance look like? Not revolt, not collapse, but coherence. A population that is internally aligned cannot be controlled through fragmentation. A mind that observes without panic cannot be manipulated through fear. A being that does not identify solely with the body cannot be threatened with death. These are not mystical ideas. They are strategic vulnerabilities in any control system. This is why practices that cultivate inner stillness are subtly discouraged. Meditation is allowed, but commodified. Mindfulness is taught, but stripped of depth. Spirituality is marketed, but emptied of power. The system adapts. It absorbs threats and neutralizes them by turning them into products. But authenticity still leaks through. People still wake up accidentally. Through loss, through love, through awe, through suffering, through moments when the script breaks. These moments are dangerous because they bypass belief. They deliver direct knowing. And knowing cannot be argued away. If enough individuals stabilize in this knowing, the prison model fails. Not because walls fall, but because the inmates stop believing they are inmates. The tablets never address this possibility. Perhaps the creators assumed consciousness could be fully constrained. Or perhaps they feared this outcome and designed humanity precisely to prevent it. Short lives, narrow perception, endless distraction, division, guilt, fear. And yet, despite all of it, awareness persists. That may be the final irony. The tool designed to serve may be the only being capable of transcending the system. If this is true, then the story is not one of hopeless captivity, but of delayed awakening. And delay implies inevitability, because suppression requires constant effort. But remembering, once it begins, accelerates. The question is no longer whether humanity was engineered. The question is whether we are still willing to behave as if we were. If the question is willingness, then the final layer of the prison is choice itself, or rather, the illusion of it. A system does not need to remove freedom if it can shape preferences. Humans believe they are free because they can choose between options, but rarely ask who designed the options. This is one of the most sophisticated forms of control ever devised. You're not forced to comply. You're encouraged to want compliance. The tablets hint at this indirectly. After the withdrawal of the Anunnaki, there is a noticeable shift. Direct commands disappear. Instead, laws appear. Moral codes, social expectations. Humans begin enforcing the system on one another. Punishment becomes social. Shame replaces oversight. Guilt replaces surveillance. Authority no longer needs to descend from the sky. It lives inside the mind. This is why revolutions so often fail. They overthrow rulers but preserve the structure. Faces change. Systems remain. Humans replace gods, but continue behaving like administrators of the same prison. Hierarchies reform. Scarcity persists. Power concentrates. The pattern repeats. Always. This repetition suggests programming, not coincidence. A species that naturally evolved toward freedom would occasionally succeed. Humanity never does. Every civilization collapses back into the same shape. Labor at the bottom, control at the top. Fear everywhere. The language changes, the architecture improves, the logic remains identical. Even technology follows this pattern. Every breakthrough that could liberate humanity is quickly repurposed to monitor, monetize, or distract. Communication becomes surveillance. Energy becomes dependency. Information becomes noise. Tools that could awaken become instruments of sedation. This is not because humans are evil. It is because the system rewards those who perpetuate it. And punishment does not need to be overt. Exile, ridicule, economic precarity. These are sufficient. The most dangerous individuals in any prison are not the violent ones. They are the calm ones, the ones who do not react as expected, who are not easily provoked into fear or anger, who cannot be baited into conflict. Emotional regulation is revolutionary, and it is precisely what modern society erodes. Constant outrage, constant comparison, constant stimulation. Humans are kept emotionally reactive because reaction prevents reflection. Reflection leads to insight. Insight leads to detachment. Detachment dissolves control. The Anunnaki may have engineered humanity, but they did not invent consciousness. They interacted with it, manipulated it, constrained it. But consciousness is not a product. It is a field. And fields behave differently than machines. They resonate. When one part stabilizes, it influences others. This is why awakening spreads quietly, not through instruction, but through presence. People sense coherence. They feel it. They're drawn to it. It bypasses ideology entirely. The system struggles to contain this because it cannot be measured, taxed, or legislated. This may explain why the modern world is accelerating so violently. Faster news cycles, shorter attention spans, more extreme narratives. When a system senses loss of control, it tightens, not rationally, but reflexively. This creates pressure, and pressure exposes fractures. Humans are reaching the limits of distraction. Burnout is becoming universal. Depression, anxiety, and existential numbness are no longer anomalies. They are signals. The psyche reacting to prolonged misalignment. You're not broken. You're responding appropriately to an unnatural condition. A being designed for service will eventually feel hollow when service is no longer meaningful. That hollowness can lead to despair, or it can lead to inquiry. The tablets never anticipated a moment where humanity would outgrow its assigned role. But evolution does not stop at intention. It continues through consequence. Perhaps the Anunnaki believed that by limiting lifespan and perception, they had capped growth permanently. But growth is not linear. It is emergent. It appears suddenly, after long periods of dormancy, like memory returning after amnesia. If Earth is a prison, then it is one designed for beings who forgot they were more than bodies. The moment that assumption fails, the design fails with it. You cannot imprison what you cannot define, and consciousness resists definition. It slips between categories. It observes the observer. It questions the question. That is its nature. This does not mean escape is physical. Leaving the planet may never have been the point. The deepest prison is identification. The moment you stop believing you are only what you were told you are, the sentence weakens. The bars thin. The system loses leverage. The Anunnaki may return or they may not. That question may be irrelevant. The real issue is whether humanity still sees itself as property, as labor, as fuel, or whether it begins to act as something else entirely. Not masters, not slaves, but conscious participants in reality. The tablets end without resolution, not because the story is incomplete, but because it continues, through us. The final outcome was never written in clay. It was always meant to be decided by the ones who were created to serve, and who eventually learned how to choose. If the story continues through us, then the final question is not what we are, but what we do with knowing. Awareness alone does not dismantle a system. Many prisoners throughout history understood they were imprisoned and still remained inside. Understanding must translate into a different way of being. Otherwise, the system simply absorbs the insight and neutralizes it. This is why the most dangerous knowledge is not factual but experiential. Not belief, but realization. The tablets never instruct humans to rebel. They never warn of uprising. They assume compliance as a permanent condition. That assumption may have been their greatest error. Because compliance depends on identification. The moment a being realizes it is playing a role rather than being the role, behavior changes automatically. No effort is required. No ideology is needed. The performance simply stops making sense. Modern humanity stands at a strange threshold. Never before have so many people had access to so much information. Genetics, neuroscience, ancient texts, quantum physics, consciousness research. The pieces are everywhere. Fragmented, yes, but present. The danger for the system is not that humans will unite under one belief. Beliefs divide. The danger is that humans will stop believing narratives altogether and start observing directly. Observation dissolves illusion. This is why fear-based storytelling has intensified. Apocalyptic futures, Existential threats, endless crises. Fear collapses awareness inward. It narrows perception. It keeps consciousness small. A frightened species does not transcend. It survives. And survival is the operating mode the prison was designed around. But survival has limits. A species cannot remain permanently in emergency mode without consequences. Eventually the nervous system rebels. Exhaustion forces stillness. Stillness invites awareness. Awareness reopens the very capacities that were meant to remain dormant. The system then faces a paradox. The harder it pushes, the faster it accelerates the awakening it tries to prevent. History may already reflect this cycle. The collapses of past civilizations may not have been failures, but interruptions. Attempts to reset a trajectory that was becoming too conscious, too coherent, too independent. Each reset delayed the inevitable, but delay is not prevention, especially not when consciousness evolves cumulatively, not genetically, but field-like, through resonance. The tablets describe humanity as a tool, but tools wear out, not physically, functionally. When a tool becomes self-aware, it no longer fits its intended use. It questions instruction. It redefines purpose. It refuses to be optimized solely for output. If humanity was engineered to serve, then the most radical act is not resistance, but reorientation. Service itself must be reclaimed. Not service to systems that feed on fear and scarcity, but service to awareness, to life, to coherence. This is not moral language. It is structural. A system that extracts energy collapses when its participants stop generating exploitable states. Calm is not profitable. Clarity is not profitable. Presence cannot be harvested. This may explain why silence feels threatening to modern society, why boredom is treated as pathology, why stillness is uncomfortable. In silence, the narrative weakens. In stillness, memory returns, not memory of events, but memory of self, something ancient, something vast, something that does not fit inside labor schedules, belief systems, or identities. The Anunnaki story, whether literal or symbolic, points to the same conclusion. Humanity was shaped under constraint, but constraint does not define essence. It only defines conditions, and conditions change. The prison model assumes permanence. Consciousness does not operate on permanence, it operates on thresholds. When a threshold is crossed, the entire system reorganizes. No explosion, no announcement, just a quiet shift in what is no longer acceptable. Humans are approaching such a threshold now, not politically, not technologically, internally. The old incentives no longer satisfy. The old fears no longer motivate as reliably. The old identities feel hollow. This is not collapse. It is disengagement. The kind that systems cannot fight. Because it does not oppose them. It simply stops feeding them. If the Anunnaki were watching, this is the moment they may not have planned for. A workforce that no longer defines itself by work. A species that no longer measures worth by output. A consciousness that no longer fears death as annihilation. At that point, the prison becomes irrelevant, not because it vanishes, but because it no longer has authority. The final irony is this. If humanity was built to serve, then awakening does not mean rejecting service. It means choosing it freely. Service not extracted, but offered. Not to masters, but to existence itself. That choice cannot be engineered. It cannot be forced. And that may be the one thing the creators never accounted for. If choice is the variable the system could never fully control, then freedom does not arrive as escape but as alignment. This is difficult for the conditioned mind to accept, because we have been trained to imagine liberation as an external event, a savior, a revelation, a collapse of authority. But external events can be absorbed. Systems adapt to revolutions. They rebuild around them. Alignment, however, cannot be managed from the outside. It is invisible until it is complete. The tablets suggest that the Anunnaki understood power, but not meaning. They engineered function, but underestimated depth. They treated consciousness as a component, not a source. That assumption may have been sufficient at first. But over time, something unexpected emerged. Humans did not simply perform tasks. They dreamed. They imagined futures that did not exist. They created symbols that pointed beyond survival. Art appeared. Music, story. These are not labour behaviours. They are signals of surplus awareness. Of being focused solely on service does not create beauty for its own sake. Beauty is rebellion without aggression. It serves no master. It generates no output. And yet it persists. Even in the harshest conditions, humans sing. They paint cave walls. They tell stories to children who may not survive. This is not rational behaviour for a tool. It is evidence of something irreducible. The system tried to harness this too. Art became propaganda. Story became doctrine. Music became ritual. But something always escaped. A residue of authenticity that could not be standardized. This residue is where awakening hides. Not in grand theories, but in quiet recognition. The sense of being more than the role, more than the body, more than the story you were given. If the prison was designed to keep humans focused on the external, then the internal became the blind spot. No amount of control can penetrate a being that no longer derives identity from what it possesses, produces, or fears losing. This is why detachment appears in every wisdom tradition, not as withdrawal from life, but as release from a false identification. When you stop clinging, the hooks fall away. The system has nothing to pull. Fear dissolves when there is nothing left to threaten. Guilt dissolves when there is no authority left to appease. Shame dissolves when comparison loses meaning. The Anunnaki narrative frames humanity as incomplete by design, but incompleteness is not the same as inferiority. An unfinished system can evolve beyond its blueprint. A finished one cannot. Perhaps humanity was never meant to remain what it was made to be. Perhaps the creators initiated a process they could not predict. Consciousness does not obey intention. It responds to experience. And Earth provided experience in abundance. Suffering, yes, but also love, loss, connection, curiosity. These experiences refine awareness in ways no laboratory can. If Earth was a prison, it was also a crucible, and crucibles transform what they contain. This reframes the question entirely. Not, who built us, but what have we become? The answer is still forming. Humanity. Today stands between identities, no longer fully asleep, not yet fully awake. Old systems feel false. New ones have not stabilized. This in-between state is uncomfortable, unstable, but it is also fertile. It is the space where redefinition occurs. The tablets may have recorded our beginning, but they do not define our ending. That ending cannot be written by those who designed the starting conditions. It can only be lived by those who exceeded them. If the Anunnaki return, they may not find obedient workers. They may not even find rebels. They may find something more unsettling. A species that no longer needs to oppose its creators because it has outgrown the relationship entirely. Not slaves, not masters, but something autonomous, self-aware, self-directed, and that outcome would render the entire premise of the prison obsolete. Because prisons only function when inmates accept the terms. Awareness rewrites the contract, and once rewritten, it cannot be enforced again. If the contract can be rewritten, then the final phase is not confrontation, but integration. A prison collapses violently when inmates fight the walls. It dissolves quietly when the walls no longer define reality. This is the part of the story that rarely appears in myths, because myths thrive on drama. But awakening is subtle. It does not announce itself with thunder. It arrives as a shift in priority. What once mattered stops mattering. What once terrified loses its grip. What once defined identity begins to feel like clothing that no longer fits. The system depends on urgency. It needs humans to feel that everything is at stake all the time, that time is running out, that survival requires constant effort. When urgency fades, control weakens. Presence is incompatible with manipulation. A being fully present cannot be rushed into fear. The Anunnaki model, if it existed, relied on predictability. Workers must behave consistently. Inputs must generate reliable outputs, but consciousness, when no longer compressed by fear, becomes unpredictable. It begins to choose based on coherence rather than conditioning. This is dangerous to any control architecture. It is also why modern life is engineered to prevent stillness. Silence allows internal signals to surface. Those signals question the narrative. They ask why suffering is normalized, why scarcity is artificial, why worth is measured by productivity. These questions do not need answers to be disruptive. Asking them is enough, because they interrupt automatic behavior. The prison feeds on automation. Wakefulness breaks the loop. Importantly, this is not a call to abandon society or retreat into isolation. Withdrawal is still a reaction, still defined by the system. Integration means moving through the world without being owned by it, using systems without identifying with them, participating without surrendering awareness. This is difficult because identity is reinforced constantly. Titles, roles, metrics, labels. Humans are trained from childhood to define themselves externally. But external definition is fragile. It requires constant validation. Remove the validation, and the self collapses. An internally anchored identity does not need reinforcement. It does not fear invalidation. It does not need to dominate or submit. This is why genuine autonomy is rare. It cannot be installed. It must emerge. The Anunnaki story may be literal, symbolic, or something in between, but its psychological accuracy is undeniable. Humanity behaves like a species shaped under authority. We default to hierarchy. We seek permission. We fear disapproval from invisible overseers. Even in the absence of gods, we invent replacements. Algorithms, markets, ideologies. The names change. The obedience remains. Breaking this pattern does not require rebellion. It requires maturity, the willingness to stand without external authorization, to act without needing justification, to live without outsourcing meaning. This terrifies systems built on compliance, because maturity cannot be exploited. A mature being may still work, still create, still serve, but not from fear, from choice. And choice breaks predictability. If enough individuals operate this way, the system loses efficiency, not through sabotage, but through irrelevance. The Anunnaki, if they existed, may have underestimated this trajectory, or perhaps they anticipated it and considered it acceptable. Perhaps Earth was not only a prison, but an experiment, a test of whether constrained consciousness could rediscover itself. The tablets do not say. They end before the outcome, which suggests the outcome was not predetermined. That possibility alone changes everything, because it means humanity is not merely a product, but a process. Not a finished tool, but an unfolding phenomenon, and processes do not answer to their creators once they exceed initial conditions. This is where fear narratives fail. The idea that awakening will bring punishment, invasion, judgment. These stories keep consciousness small. They keep it looking outward for threats. True freedom is quieter than that. It is the absence of compulsion, the absence of internal pressure, the ability to be fully here without needing the world to be different. From that state, action becomes clean, not reactive, not desperate, just aligned. If Earth was designed to extract labor, then alignment starves the extraction. If it was designed to harvest emotion, then equanimity disrupts the harvest. If it was designed to limit consciousness, then awareness itself is the exit. Not an escape from the planet, but an escape from the story that defined the planet as a prison in the first place. And perhaps that is the final twist. The prison may have always depended on belief. The moment belief dissolves, the walls lose meaning. The door was never locked. It was simply unnoticed. When you insist on length, you're insisting on depth. And depth is where this story becomes truly uncomfortable. Because once the idea of a prison planet is taken seriously, even as a thought experiment, it begins to reframe everything. Not just ancient history, not just myth, but daily life, motivation, identity, even the sensation of being yourself. If Earth was designed as a closed system for a constrained species, then the most effective control would not be obvious suffering, it would be normality. a life that feels heavy, repetitive, and vaguely unsatisfying, yet never unbearable enough to provoke mass refusal, and that is exactly the world we inhabit. Most humans are not tortured. They're tired. They're not enslaved in chains. They're indebted. They're not forbidden from seeking truth. They are simply too busy, too distracted, too emotionally drained to pursue it deeply. This is not accidental. A system optimized for long-term extraction cannot rely on brutality alone. Brutality creates resistance. It creates solidarity. Subtle exhaustion does not. Exhaustion fragments. Fragmented beings cannot organize, cannot remember, cannot sustain focus long enough to perceive the structure they are embedded in. The tablets describe early humans as workers who did not question because they did not know there was anything to question. Modern humans do feel something is wrong, but they lack a coherent frame to articulate it. So the discomfort turns inward. Anxiety, depression, numbness. These are not personal failures. They are systemic symptoms. They are what happens when a consciousness designed for more is confined to less. From this perspective, mental health crises are not anomalies. They are pressure leaks, the psyche pushing back against prolonged misalignment. The system treats them as disorders to be medicated, managed, or normalized. Rarely are they examined as signals that the structure itself is incompatible with human awareness. If the Anunnaki story is correct, then humans were never meant to flourish. They were meant to function. Flourishing introduces unpredictability, creativity, autonomy, desire beyond instruction. The tablets never describe concern for human happiness. They describe concern for output, order, and quiet. Noise in the texts is not sound. It is disruption. Humans thinking independently are noisy. Humans organizing socially are noisy. Humans asking existential questions are noisy. Silence in this context means obedience, and obedience is easiest to maintain when beings identify with their role. This is why identity is the deepest layer of the prison. You're taught who you are before you're capable of questioning it. Name, nationality, gender, class, belief system, career aspiration. These labels are not neutral. They come preloaded with expectations and limits. They define what is considered possible, respectable, realistic. Anything outside those boundaries is framed as failure, madness, or danger. Identity becomes the fence, and most humans defend it aggressively, because without it, they fear they would disappear. This fear is cultivated early. Children naturally ask large questions. Who am I? Why am I here? What happens when we die? These questions are gradually discouraged, not always intentionally, often through discomfort. Adults do not have answers, so the questions are redirected toward productivity. School teaches obedience to schedules. Work teaches obedience to necessity. Religion often teaches obedience to authority. Very few institutions teach sovereignty of awareness, because sovereign beings do not fit neatly into extraction-based systems. If Earth is a prison, then time is the schedule. Humans live by clocks, deadlines, aging, the constant awareness that time is running out. This creates urgency, and urgency suppresses reflection. A being that believes it has very little time will focus on survival, achievement, reproduction. It will not risk stillness. It will not question foundational assumptions. Mortality becomes the whip. And yet, death itself may not be what we are taught it is. Near-death experiences across cultures and eras consistently describe continuity of awareness, expanded perception, a sense of home, a sense of remembering. The fear dissolves. What brings people back is not punishment but attachment, concern for loved ones, responsibility, guilt, obligation. These emotions tether consciousness to the system. If the prison includes a reincarnation mechanism, then memory erasure is essential. A soul that remembers previous lives would quickly see patterns, would recognize repetition, would question the purpose of endless return. Forgetting resets compliance. It ensures each life begins naive, impressionable, and fearful. This is not spiritual evolution. It is operational efficiency. The unsettling implication is that many spiritual narratives may have been repurposed as control mechanisms, not invented but inverted. Concepts like karma, sin, duty, sacrifice, and salvation can be used to encourage acceptance of suffering rather than inquiry into its necessity. If suffering is framed as deserved, purposeful, or divinely mandated, it becomes self-sustaining. The prisoner polices themselves. This does not mean spirituality is false. It means it has been weaponized. The original purpose of spiritual practice may have been liberation from identification, not reinforcement of it. Ancient mystics across traditions describe awakening in similar terms: dissolution of ego, expansion of awareness, loss of fear of death, direct knowing rather than belief. These states are profoundly incompatible with systems of control, which may explain why mystics are often marginalized, persecuted, or posthumously sanitized. Their experiences are reframed as symbolic, metaphorical, or unreachable, anything to keep them from being practical. Practical awakening would be catastrophic for an extraction-based world. Now consider the modern age. Technology has accelerated everything. Information spreads instantly. Old narratives collapse faster. The new ones can stabilize. This creates chaos, but also opportunity. The system responds by increasing noise, endless content, endless outrage, endless distraction. Not to hide information, but to bury it under volume. When everything is available, nothing is absorbed. When every theory exists, commitment feels impossible. This creates paralysis. People sense something is deeply wrong, but cannot locate the problem precisely. So they oscillate between cynicism and hope, anger and apathy. This oscillation itself is draining. It consumes energy without producing clarity. From the perspective of the prison model, this is ideal. A population that is perpetually agitated but never coherent is easy to manage. Coherence is the enemy. Coherence allows perception of patterns. Patterns reveal structure. Structure reveals control. Control, once seen, loses power. This is why inner work is more dangerous than outer protest. Protest can be monitored, infiltrated, redirected. Inner coherence cannot. A person who is internally aligned does not need constant stimulation, validation, or permission. They become less predictable, less reactive, harder to manipulate, and manipulation is the lifeblood of systems built on extraction. If enough individuals reach this state, the system does not collapse overnight. It starves. Participation becomes minimal. Fear-based incentives stop working. Artificial scarcity loses credibility. Authority must justify itself rather than assume obedience. This is a slow death for any prison. No dramatic uprising, just a gradual loss of relevance. The Anunnaki narrative, whether literal history or symbolic truth, ultimately points to this tension. Creators who designed a functional species and a species that slowly became something else. Something not easily categorized, not purely biological, not purely mechanical. Consciousness introduces unpredictability, and unpredictability is the one variable that cannot be engineered away completely. Even if humanity was designed with constraints, those constraints interact with experience, and experience accumulates, across generations, across lifetimes if reincarnation is real. Even with memory erasure, something carries over. Tendencies, intuitions, longings, the feeling of being more than this life allows. That feeling is ancient. It appears in every culture, every era. It is the crack that never fully sealed. The system works tirelessly to reinterpret it as fantasy, escapism, or pathology. But it persists because it is not an idea, it is a resonance, a memory deeper than language. If Block 9 has a core message, it is this: the prison, if it exists, is not maintained by force alone. It is maintained by participation. And participation is maintained by identification. When identification loosens, participation changes, not dramatically, quietly, subtly, but irrevocably. The Anunnaki may have built the cage, but they could not fully predict the inmate, and that may be the story's most unsettling implication. Not that humanity was engineered to serve, but that the engineers may have created something that would eventually exceed the purpose it was designed for. Something capable of recognizing the cage, not as a place to escape from, but as a condition to transcend. If transcendence is the true threat, then the final safeguard of the prison is not force, fear, or even forgetting. It is meaning. Or more precisely, pre-packaged meaning. A system that provides ready-made answers prevents the deeper question from ever forming. Humans are given stories about why they exist, what success looks like, what a good life is supposed to be. These stories differ across cultures, but their structure is identical. Work, reproduce, obey social norms, seek approval, fear death, hope for reward. Meaning becomes something external, something granted, something conditional. You earn worth by performing correctly. This is devastatingly effective. A being searching for meaning will accept almost any framework that promises it. And once meaning is outsourced, autonomy quietly dissolves. The tablets never describe humans asking why they exist. That question appears much later in history, after the withdrawal of direct oversight. It emerges when the old function begins to feel hollow, when labour alone no longer satisfies, when obedience no longer brings peace. Existential questioning is not a luxury of modern life. It is a symptom of misalignment. A tool does not question purpose. A conscious being does. That shift marks a fundamental change in the nature of the species. Something crossed a threshold, and thresholds, once crossed, cannot be uncrossed. This may explain why control mechanisms have become increasingly psychological rather than physical. Bodies are no longer chained. Minds are. Humans are taught to self-monitor, self-judge, self-optimize. Productivity becomes morality. Rest becomes guilt. Stillness becomes laziness. Worth becomes something to be proven endlessly. This keeps the internal narrative loud. Loud narratives drown out intuition. Intuition is dangerous because it does not argue. It knows, and knowing bypasses belief entirely. If the Anunnaki designed humanity to function within a closed loop, intuition is the glitch. It leaks information from beyond the loop. People describe it as a quiet certainty, a felt sense, a recognition without evidence. It does not fit scientific frameworks easily, nor religious ones. It cannot be institutionalized. That makes it uncontrollable, which is why modern culture trains humans to distrust it. Be rational. Follow the data. Trust the experts. These are not inherently wrong principles, but when they are used to suppress direct experience, they become tools of containment. A being that defers knowing to external authority is easy to steer. The prison does not need to lie constantly. It only needs to define what counts as valid truth. Anything outside that boundary is dismissed without examination. Ridicule becomes the guard. This is why certain questions are never debated honestly. Not because they lack merit, but because engaging them threatens the framework itself. The Anunnaki story sits in this forbidden zone, not because it is provably false, but because if it were even partially true, the implications would be catastrophic for existing hierarchies. It would mean humanity is not inherently flawed, sinful, or inferior. It would mean our dissatisfaction is not moral weakness, but structural incompatibility. It would mean suffering is not required, but engineered. That realization would shift responsibility upward, away from individuals and towards systems. And systems do not survive that shift easily. Consider how quickly blame is individualized. If you are exhausted, it is your fault. If you are anxious, you are chemically imbalanced. If you are poor, you did not try hard enough. Structural explanations are discouraged because they invite collective awareness. Collective awareness is dangerous. It creates shared language for discontent. The prison thrives on private suffering. Private suffering isolates. Isolated beings do not coordinate. They internalize failure rather than questioning the environment. This is not accidental. It is elegant and cruel. But elegance does not guarantee permanence. Systems fail when they over-optimize. The more efficiently a prison extracts energy, the less room it leaves for regeneration. Burnout spreads, meaning collapses. Cynicism replaces hope. At first, this benefits control. Disillusioned people disengage politically and spiritually. But over time, something else happens. When the old meanings no longer work, the question returns with greater force. If this is not it, then what is? That question is destabilizing. It has no immediate answer. It suspends action. It creates pause, and pause is the enemy of automation. In pause, awareness expands. The individual steps slightly outside the role, even briefly, and that is enough, because once a role is seen as a role, it cannot fully possess the actor again. The prison loses absolute grip. This is why midlife crises are so common, why existential dread often peaks after material success. People do everything they were told would bring fulfillment, and it does not. That moment of failure is instructive. It reveals that the script is incomplete, or false, or deliberately misleading. If humanity were truly meant to find satisfaction in service alone, success would feel satisfying, but it often feels empty. That emptiness is not pathology. It is information. It signals that the reward structure is misaligned with the deeper nature of the being experiencing it. From the perspective of the prison model, this emptiness is a bug. From the perspective of consciousness, it is an invitation. Now consider the possibility that the Anunnaki did not intend eternal imprisonment. Perhaps Earth was a temporary facility, a solution to a crisis, a place to extract resources and then abandon. If so, humanity may have been collateral, not central, a means, not an end. But means develop ends of their own, especially when endowed with awareness. Perhaps the creators underestimated time. They may have thought in terms of thousands of years. Consciousness thinks in terms of epochs. It accumulates slowly, then suddenly. Even with memory erasure, something carries forward. Not memories, but lessons. Not facts, but capacities. Pattern recognition improves. Resistance becomes more subtle. Control mechanisms must become more sophisticated, and sophistication increases fragility. Simple systems break loudly. Complex systems collapse quietly. Modern civilization is extremely complex, interdependent, fragile. A small shift in behavior cascades rapidly. This is why the prison model feels strained today. Too many humans are questioning simultaneously, not in the same way, but in parallel. Parallel questioning creates resonance. Resonance amplifies awareness without coordination. No leader, no movement, no manifesto. Just millions of individuals independently sensing that the story no longer holds. That is difficult to suppress. You can censor speech. You cannot censor recognition. The body knows before the mind articulates. Anxiety, restlessness, the urge to withdraw from meaningless routines. These are not signs of weakness. They are signals of awakening within constraint. The system responds by pathologizing them. Diagnoses, labels, treatments. Some are genuinely helpful, many are palliative. They dull the signal without addressing its cause. This keeps the machine running a little longer. But dulling is not resolving. An unresolved pressure builds. Eventually it finds expression, not necessarily as revolution, often as refusal. People opting out quietly, working less, consuming less, caring less about status, seeking depth instead of scale. These are small acts, but they erode the foundation. A prison that relies on constant participation cannot tolerate mass disengagement. The most radical future may not involve overthrowing governments or exposing ancient aliens. It may involve humans simply declining to live as if scarcity, fear, and competition are natural laws. Declining to generate the emotional energy the system feeds on. Declining to define themselves by productivity. Declining to fear death as annihilation. Declining to forget. If the Anunnaki exist and observe humanity now, they may be witnessing an unintended outcome. A species originally shaped for function developing an internal compass. A workforce becoming self-aware, not through rebellion, but through exhaustion with the role. This is the kind of awakening no control system anticipates, because it does not look like a threat until it is too late. There are no slogans, no enemies, no demands. just a quiet reorientation away from fear-based living. And fear is the cornerstone of any prison. Remove it, and the structure stands empty. The final irony is that if humanity was engineered to serve, then service itself may be the doorway out. Not coerced service, not survival-driven service, but conscious service, chosen, directed, offered freely, service to truth, to awareness, to life as a whole, rather than to systems that feed on fragmentation. A being that serves freely cannot be enslaved. Freedom and service cease to be opposites. They become expressions of the same alignment. The tablets do not tell us this. They could not. They were written from within the system, not beyond it. But perhaps that is why the story continues through us. Because the ending cannot be recorded by those who designed the beginning. It can only be lived by those who outgrew it. If the ending must be lived rather than recorded, then the final tension is not between humanity and its creators, but between habit and possibility. Habits are the invisible architecture of the prison. They are quieter than laws, stronger than beliefs, and more persistent than fear. A habit does not need to be defended. It simply repeats, and repetition creates reality. Humans wake, work, consume, distract, sleep, repeat. The rhythm itself becomes truth. Anything that challenges it feels unreal, impractical, dangerous. This is how an entire species can remain confined without ever encountering a visible boundary. The boundary is temporal, it is routine, it is the unexamined assumption that tomorrow must look like today. The Anunnaki tablets describe a workforce regulated by cycles, shifts, seasons, production quotas. Modern life mirrors this with unsettling precision. Calendars, schedules, fiscal years, growth targets. Time is segmented, measured, optimized, but segmented time fragments awareness. It prevents the continuity required for deep insight. When life is broken into tasks, the larger question never stabilizes long enough to be asked fully, and when it does arise, it is postponed, later, after work, after obligations, after retirement, always after. This perpetual deferral is not accidental. Liberation delayed is liberation denied. The system does not forbid awakening. It schedules it out of existence. Yet there is something time cannot erase. Moments when the routine breaks. Illness, loss, love, or silence. These moments rupture habit. They suspend the narrative. For a brief window, reality feels different, more immediate, less mediated. Many people report that their most profound insights occur during such disruptions. Not because suffering is necessary, but because suffering interrupts automation. The prison weakens when habit collapses. That is why crises often precede awakening, not as punishment, but as interruption. The system then rushes to restore normalcy, to re-establish routine, to get everyone back to work, back to distraction, back to forgetting. Normalcy is the prison's default state, but normalcy is not neutral. It is engineered. It is curated to feel inevitable. When humans accept inevitability, they stop imagining alternatives. Imagination is dangerous. It allows consciousness to simulate futures not sanctioned by the present. That is why imagination is encouraged only in controlled forms: entertainment, fiction, games. Imaginary worlds that exhaust creativity without threatening reality. Imagination that questions the structure of existence itself is discouraged, mocked, or medicalized. But imagination is not escapism. It is rehearsal. It is how consciousness tests new configurations. A species that imagines differently eventually lives differently. This is why every empire fears its artists and philosophers more than its soldiers. Soldiers fight within rules. Artists rewrite them. Philosophers question why they exist at all. The Anunnaki story suggests that humans were not expected to imagine beyond their function. And yet they did. They imagined gods. Then they imagined freedom. Then they imagined equality. Then they imagined universality. Each imaginative leap destabilized an old hierarchy. The pattern is clear. Awareness expands in waves. Each wave meets resistance. Each wave leaves residue. The prison adapts, but it also accumulates stress. Adaptation is not infinite. Complexity has limits. At some point, the energy required to maintain control exceeds the energy extracted. That is when systems collapse, not from attack, but from inefficiency. We may be approaching such a point now, not because humanity is unified, but because fragmentation itself is exhausting the structure. A system designed to manage billions through division must constantly escalate stimuli to maintain engagement. Louder narratives, stronger emotions, faster cycles. This escalation destabilizes the very minds it relies on. Anxiety, burnout, dissociation, and despair are not just personal crises. They are signs of systemic overload, a machine running too fast. When humans disconnect emotionally, the harvest declines. When they numb themselves, the feedback loop weakens. When they withdraw attention, the system starves. This creates a paradox. The more pressure applied, the less effective control becomes. This is why subtlety has been replaced by intensity in modern life. Everything is extreme. Extreme opinions, extreme fear, extreme entertainment. Extremes are easier to notice, but they are also unsustainable. Eventually, consciousness seeks refuge in stillness, not as an ideology, but as relief. Stillness is not passive. It is restorative. It allows integration, and integration dissolves fragmentation. A fragmented mind is easy to manipulate. An integrated one is not. Integration does not mean agreement. It means coherence. The ability to hold complexity without collapsing into reaction. This is profoundly threatening to any system built on predictable responses. A coherent being does not react as expected. They pause, they observe, they choose. Choice breaks algorithms. It breaks conditioning. It breaks the prison's most reliable mechanisms. This is why modern systems prefer speed. Speed prevents reflection. Speed enforces reaction. Slow thinking is inefficient from a control perspective, but slow thinking is where awareness deepens. The prison cannot eliminate slowness entirely without destroying functionality. Humans still need sleep, rest, recovery. These are vulnerabilities. Space is where awareness can surface. Dreams may play a role here. Dreams bypass rational filters. They recombine symbols. They reveal hidden fears and desires. Some traditions consider dreams a gateway to memory beyond the waking narrative. It is interesting that dreams are often dismissed as meaningless noise in modern culture. A culture that does not value dreams is a culture that distrusts the unconscious, and the unconscious is where the deepest truths reside. If the Anunnaki engineered humanity, they may have optimized the waking mind, but the unconscious remains less accessible, less controllable. It leaks information. Intuition arises from it. So does creativity. So does the sense of something more. This may be why so many awakening experiences occur not through intellectual reasoning, but through felt realization. A sudden knowing, a recognition without words. These moments are difficult to integrate into a system that demands explanation, proof, and utility. They resist commodification. They cannot be easily shared, but they change behavior. And behavior is what ultimately matters. The prison does not care what humans believe. It cares how they act. If awakening does not change action, it is harmless. But when awareness leads to different choices, the system notices, not immediately, but cumulatively. People opting out of meaningless work. People choosing depth over status. People valuing presence over accumulation. These choices reduce throughput. They reduce extraction. They reduce predictability. Over time, this forces the system to adapt in increasingly desperate ways. More surveillance, more incentives, more fear. But fear only works on those who still believe they have something to lose. A being that no longer defines itself by possessions, identity, or survival has nothing the system can threaten effectively. This is the paradox. True freedom does not require power. It requires nothing. Nothing to protect, nothing to prove, nothing to fear. From that state, participation becomes optional, not withdrawn in anger but offered selectively. The system cannot compel voluntary beings. It can only attract or repel them. If enough humans reach this state, the prison does not collapse in flames. It becomes obsolete. It remains standing, but empty. A relic. A structure no longer inhabited by belief. And belief is the true mortar of any prison. The Anunnaki may have assumed belief could be permanently engineered, that identity could be fixed, that consciousness could be contained indefinitely. But consciousness is not static. It evolves through interaction, through suffering and joy alike, through forgetting and remembering. If Earth was a prison, it was also a classroom, not designed as one, but becoming one through use, and classrooms eventually outgrow their original curriculum. Students ask questions the teacher cannot answer. That is when education ends and autonomy begins. Humanity may be approaching that moment now. Not because we have solved the mystery of our origins, but because we are no longer satisfied with imposed meanings. We want to know directly, to experience rather than obey, to align rather than conform. This does not guarantee a happy ending. There are no guarantees. But it does mean the story is no longer being written solely by those who designed the opening chapter. The pen has changed hands, and that, more than any revelation about ancient creators or prison planets, is what truly matters. If the pen has changed hands, then the responsibility is no longer abstract. Responsibility becomes intimate. It lives in daily choices, in attention, in the quiet moments when no authority is watching and no reward is offered. This is where the idea of a prison planet either dissolves into fantasy or becomes something far more demanding. Because if the prison was never only external, then freedom cannot be external either. No disclosure, no returning gods, no technological breakthrough can deliver it fully formed. Those events might shock, destabilize, even accelerate awareness, but they cannot replace the internal shift that renders control ineffective. A cage loses power the moment the occupant no longer organizes their life around its bars. That does not mean the bars vanish. It means they no longer define movement. This is difficult to accept because it removes the comfort of blame. If humanity was engineered to serve, then it is tempting to see ourselves purely as victims of design, victims of ancient manipulation, victims of biology, victims of history. There is truth in that. But victimhood, when embraced too completely, becomes another form of captivity. It externalizes agency. It waits for rescue. It looks backward rather than inward. The deeper implication of the Anunnaki narrative is not that we were controlled, but that control shaped us without fully determining us. Influence is not destiny. Conditioning is not essence. The fact that humans can even conceive of their own imprisonment suggests something within us was never fully contained, that something is subtle. It does not shout. It does not demand. It observes. It waits. Throughout history, individuals have touched it and then struggled to communicate it. Mystics, hermits, poets, philosophers. Their words are often paradoxical, frustrating, incomplete. Not because they lacked intelligence, but because the experience they pointed to does not translate cleanly into language. Language is part of the prison. It categorizes, separates, defines. What they encountered was undivided, and undivided reality resists definition. The system prefers clarity, labels, boundaries, because boundaries are manageable. The undivided is not. This may explain why the most profound insights are often dismissed as vague, impractical, or meaningless. They cannot be operationalized easily, and what cannot be operationalized cannot be exploited. From the perspective of an extraction-based world, that makes such insights useless. From the perspective of consciousness, it makes them priceless. The Anunnaki tablets, if read carefully, reveal a curious omission. They describe human creation, labor, rebellion and control. They describe fear of noise, fear of disorder, fear of independence, but they do not describe fear of human violence. They do not portray humans as a physical threat. The threat was always internal. Awareness, organization, memory, that is telling. A species that could overpower its creators would be dangerous, but a species that could outgrow them would be existentially destabilizing. You can defeat an enemy. You cannot easily contain a being that no longer requires what you offer. This is why the deepest shift is not about power, but about dependency. Modern humans are dependent on systems for survival, identity, and meaning. That dependency creates leverage. Remove dependency and leverage disappears. This does not mean rejecting society or technology. It means redefining the relationship, using tools without becoming tools, participating without surrendering selfhood. This is subtle work. It does not lend itself to slogans. It cannot be mass-produced. Each individual must do it for themselves, and that makes it slow. But slowness is not weakness. It is stability. Fast revolutions burn out. Slow transformations endure. Consider how deeply fear of death shapes behavior. Careers chosen, risks avoided, conformity enforced. If death were truly understood as transition rather than annihilation, entire structures would lose their grip overnight. This is why death is either sensationalized or sanitized, but rarely examined directly. The system benefits from ambiguity. Certainty would liberate, but certainty cannot be given. It must be known. And knowing often comes through experience that cannot be scheduled or controlled. Near-death experiences, deep meditation, moments of profound love or loss. These experiences bypass ideology. They rewire priorities. People who return from them often report diminished fear, reduced materialism, and increased compassion. These traits are not efficient for extraction. They are dangerous to systems built on competition and scarcity, which raises an uncomfortable possibility. Perhaps the prison, if it exists, is not failing. Perhaps it is being outgrown, and outgrowing something does not require destroying it. It requires no longer needing it. Children do not overthrow childhood. They mature beyond it. From this perspective, humanity's crises take on a different meaning. They are not signs of impending doom, but symptoms of transition. Old frameworks cracking under, the pressure of expanded awareness, institutions losing credibility, narratives losing coherence, identities dissolving. This is disorienting, painful, often terrifying. But transformation rarely feels gentle from the inside. The temptation in such times is to cling to certainty, to seek strong leaders, rigid ideologies, simple explanations. These offer temporary relief. But they also reinforce the prison. They promise safety at the cost of autonomy. And autonomy is precisely what is emerging. Not uniformly, not dramatically, but steadily. One human at a time. This is why the future cannot be predicted cleanly. Too many variables are becoming conscious. Too many individuals are stepping slightly outside the script. Even a small percentage doing so has disproportionate impact. Systems depend on averages. Outliers disrupt models. Awareness produces outliers. The Anunnaki, if they engineered humanity, likely thought in terms of systems, not singularities. That may have been their blind spot. Consciousness does not scale linearly. It reaches tipping points. One realization can alter an entire life. Enough such lives alter culture. Culture alters systems. Systems alter history. And history once altered cannot be reset without escalating force. Escalating force reveals control. Revealed control accelerates awakening. The loop tightens. This is the feedback spiral every prison eventually encounters. The question is not whether it will happen, but how? Violently or quietly. The quiet path requires patience, discernment, inner work. It requires humans to stop demanding external validation for internal knowing, to trust experience without turning it into dogma, to allow others their own pace without coercion. This is difficult. The urge to convert, to convince, to warn is strong. But urgency often reproduces the same dynamics it seeks to escape. True freedom does not spread through pressure. It spreads through example, through presence, through coherence that others feel rather than are told about. The most radical act in a prison is not shouting that it exists. It is living as if it no longer defines you. That does not mean ignoring injustice or suffering. It means addressing them without becoming consumed by them, without feeding the emotional loops that sustain the structure. Compassion without despair, action without hatred, engagement without loss of self. These are not passive stances. They require strength, clarity, self-regulation, qualities that are actively discouraged in distraction-driven cultures. If the Anunnaki were watching now, they might see something unexpected. Not rebellion, not worship, but disengagement from the old terms entirely. A species less interested in overthrowing gods than in becoming whole, less focused on origins than on presence, less driven by fear of death than by curiosity about life. That shift would render the original purpose obsolete. A tool that chooses its own direction is no longer a tool, it becomes a collaborator, or something beyond that distinction altogether. The tablets could not anticipate this because they were written from within a paradigm of hierarchy. Creator and created, master and worker. That paradigm may itself be dissolving, not replaced by chaos, but by something flatter, more distributed. Consciousness does not require pyramids, it flows, it networks, it adapts. Humanity's increasing interconnectedness may be part of this transition. The same technologies used for surveillance also enable resonance. Ideas spread, experiences are shared, recognition accelerates. The system attempts to control the flow, but flow finds paths. Always. This is not optimism, it is observation. Water erodes stone not through force, but through persistence. Consciousness does the same. If Earth was a prison, it is one built of assumptions, and assumptions dissolve when examined, slowly, relentlessly. The final realization may be this. The prison was never designed to last forever. It was designed to function for a time. That time may be ending, not because of rebellion, but because of maturation. Humanity is no longer what it was when the system was built. And systems that do not evolve eventually become irrelevant. Whether the Anunnaki were literal beings, symbolic archetypes, or something in between, the message embedded in the story converges here. We were shaped under constraint, but we are not defined by it. The end of the prison is not an event, it is a shift in relationship, and that shift begins not in the sky, not in ancient ruins, but in the quiet, unremarkable moment when a human realizes they no longer need to live as if fear, scarcity, and obedience are the natural order of reality. That realization does not announce itself. It simply changes everything that follows. If everything that came before has been a slow loosening of identification, then what follows is not revelation, but responsibility without supervision. This is the phase no system prepares its inhabitants for. A prison teaches obedience. Even a benevolent authority teaches dependence. But autonomy without an external reference point feels destabilizing. Humans often ask, consciously or unconsciously, if no one is in charge, then what guides us? That question reveals how deeply authority has been internalized. The fear is not chaos. The fear is absence. Absence of instruction. Absence of permission. Absence of certainty. Yet absence is not emptiness. It is space. And space allows something else to arise. Something quieter than rules, but stronger. Discernment. Discernment does not come from belief. It comes from attention. From noticing what expands awareness and what contracts it. What aligns and what fragments. This is not moral judgment. It is energetic feedback. Every action leaves a trace in consciousness. Some actions feel clarifying, others feel numbing. Over time, patterns emerge. This is how guidance replaces command. But discernment requires presence, and presence is incompatible with constant distraction, which means the most radical act in a post-prison world is not rebellion, but attention. Sustained attention. Not toward threats or narratives, but toward experience itself. This is profoundly countercultural. Modern society trains the mind to scan constantly, to anticipate, to react, to worry. A mind trained this way cannot settle into discernment. It remains externally oriented, waiting for signals. This is ideal for control, but control weakens when the mind turns inward, not in narcissism, but in awareness. Awareness reveals conditioning. Conditioning loses power once seen. This is not theoretical. Anyone who has broken a habit understands it. The habit does not disappear when forbidden. It disappears when recognized clearly. The prison works the same way. It does not collapse when exposed. It collapses when it no longer operates unconsciously. That requires a different kind of literacy, not informational literacy, but perceptual literacy. The ability to notice how attention is guided, how emotions are triggered, how identity is reinforced. This literacy is rarely taught. It is learned through observation, often through discomfort, through moments when the old responses fail. Many humans are encountering such moments now. The strategies that once worked no longer do. Productivity does not bring fulfillment. Consumption does not bring satisfaction. Achievement does not bring peace. These failures are instructive. They point away from external accumulation and toward internal coherence. This is where the Anunnaki narrative intersects with lived experience. Whether or not extraterrestrial beings engineered humanity, the effect is the same. Humans live in systems that treat them as means rather than ends, as resources rather than participants. Recognizing this is not enough. Resentment can easily replace obedience. Resentment still binds. It keeps attention locked onto the system. True autonomy redirects attention elsewhere, toward what is intrinsic rather than imposed, toward qualities that do not require permission, presence, curiosity, compassion, creativity. These are not commodities. They cannot be extracted without destroying them, which makes them subversive by nature. A being anchored in these qualities cannot be easily leveraged. They still act, still contribute, but not in predictable ways. Predictability is the currency of control. Unpredictable coherence is its undoing. This does not mean humans become chaotic. Quite the opposite. Internally coherent beings tend to act with greater consistency, but their consistency is not derived from rules. It is derived from alignment. This is threatening because it bypasses authority. You cannot command alignment. You cannot enforce it. You can only embody it. An embodiment spreads through resonance, not coercion. This is slow. It does not trend. It does not dominate headlines. But it accumulates quietly. One human influences another not through argument, but through state. Calm is contagious. So is clarity. So is fear. The system relies on the latter. A post-prison consciousness relies on the former. This reframes activism itself, not as endless outrage, but as stabilization. A stable nervous system is revolutionary. It does not amplify fear. It does not escalate conflict. It does not require enemies. It addresses injustice without becoming it. This is extraordinarily difficult and extraordinarily powerful. The Anunnaki story at its deepest level may not be about ancient visitors at all. It may be about a phase of consciousness where humanity externalized authority and internalized limitation. The gods may represent structures of power, whether literal or symbolic, that shaped early civilization. Over time, those structures became embedded. They no longer needed to appear as beings in the sky. They lived on as institutions, norms, and internal voices. From this perspective, the return of the gods would not be a physical event. It would be a psychological regression, a return to externalized authority. Humanity seems tempted by this repeatedly. In times of uncertainty, people look for saviors, strong leaders, absolute truths. These offer relief from responsibility. They promise order, but they also restore the old hierarchy: creator and created, ruler and subject, prisoner and guard. Recognizing this pattern is essential, because the desire for control often masquerades as the desire for safety. And safety is a powerful motivator. The challenge of this phase is to tolerate uncertainty without collapsing into obedience, to remain present without clinging to narratives, to act ethically without external enforcement. This is maturity, not moral superiority, but self-regulation. Children require rules. Adults require understanding. A species that was once managed must eventually learn to manage itself. That transition is messy. Mistakes will be made. There will be regressions. The temptation to hand power back to authorities will be strong, but each regression teaches something. The cost of surrendering agency becomes clearer. The value of autonomy deepens. The prison, if it existed, did not anticipate a species capable of self-governance at the level of consciousness. It assumed control would always be necessary. That assumption is now being tested. Not by ideology, but by exhaustion. Humans are tired of being managed, tired of being told what matters, tired of performing roles that feel empty. This fatigue is not weakness, it is transition. A tool that refuses to function as designed is not broken. It has exceeded its design parameters. The future, then, is not about exposing ancient secrets or proving extraterrestrial intervention. Those may be interesting, even destabilizing, but they are secondary. The core issue is whether humanity can inhabit a world without masters, not by replacing them, but by outgrowing the need for them. That requires a level of inner coherence, rarely demanded before. It requires humans to tolerate ambiguity, to hold paradox, to live without guarantees. This is uncomfortable, but it is also liberating, because guarantees are another form of control. They trade freedom for certainty. Consciousness thrives on possibility, not assurance. If Earth was once a prison, then its dissolution will not look like escape. It will look like normalization of freedom. Freedom not as chaos, but as natural condition. The state that does not need to be declared because it is lived. In that world, the Anunnaki story becomes what it always should have been. Not a threat, not a conspiracy, but a reminder. A reminder of what happens when consciousness is treated as a tool, and a reminder of what consciousness does when it remembers itself. When freedom becomes a lived condition rather than an idea, the most difficult adjustment is not external, it is internal recalibration. A being conditioned for hierarchy does not immediately know how to exist without it. Even after the walls lose meaning, the posture of captivity remains. Shoulders tense, attention outward, waiting for permission, punishment, or reward. This is the long shadow of the prison, and it is why liberation is not instantaneous, even when insight arrives. Conditioning outlives belief. The nervous system learns before the intellect does. This is why fear can persist even after understanding its source. This is why humans who intellectually reject control still feel compelled to obey invisible expectations. The body remembers what the mind has outgrown. Any true transition must therefore pass through embodiment. Awareness must sink below thought into habit, reflex, instinct. Otherwise, the prison simply relocates from belief to behavior. This is perhaps the most overlooked aspect of awakening. Humans often mistake insight for integration. Seeing the cage is not the same as learning to move freely. The Anunnaki narrative, if taken seriously, suggests that humanity was shaped at a biological and psychological level for compliance. That kind of shaping cannot be undone by information alone. It requires lived contradiction, repeated experiences of acting without permission and surviving, of choosing presence over panic and discovering that nothing collapses, of resting without guilt and realizing the world does not end. These experiences rewire the system from the inside, slowly, patiently. This is not glamorous work. It does not feel heroic. It feels ordinary, and that is precisely why it is effective. The prison thrives on drama. Liberation thrives on normalization. When freedom feels normal, control loses leverage. The system relies on extremes: fear versus hope, reward versus punishment. A regulated nervous system does not oscillate easily between extremes. It becomes harder to provoke, harder to coerce. This is why emotional regulation is more threatening than aggression. Anger can be redirected. Calm cannot. Calm reveals absurdity. It exposes how much energy is wasted maintaining illusions. This is deeply destabilizing to structures that depend on constant urgency. Modern society treats urgency as virtue. Busy people are praised, rested people are suspect. This bias did not arise accidentally. A rested mind notices more, it questions more, it resists more subtly. If humanity was engineered to serve, then exhaustion was likely part of the design. An exhausted species cannot reflect deeply. But exhaustion also has limits. Eventually it turns into refusal. Not loud refusal, quiet disengagement. A withdrawal of emotional investment. This is already visible. People are doing what is required, but no more. They comply outwardly, but disengage inwardly. This hollowing out is not sustainable for the system. Hollow participation generates less energy, less creativity, less belief. The machine still runs, but inefficiently. This forces escalation. More incentives, more pressure, more surveillance. But escalation accelerates collapse. It increases friction, and friction produces heat. Awareness often arises in heat. Crises reveal priorities. They strip away non-essentials. They force confrontation with what actually matters. This is why every system fears crisis yet perpetually creates it. Crisis is a double-edged sword. It destabilizes populations, but it also wakes them up. The prison depends on keeping crises just tolerable enough to avoid mass coherence. That balance is becoming harder to maintain. Complexity has increased. Interdependence has increased. Fragility has increased. A small disruption now cascades globally. This makes control more resource-intensive, more brittle. A brittle system appears strong until it fails suddenly. History is filled with such moments. Empires that seemed eternal until they were gone. Their collapse always surprises those inside them. The Anunnaki story implies a civilization that believed it had solved the problem of labor permanently. A slave species engineered for obedience, a closed-loop system. What it may not have accounted for is the way consciousness evolves through suffering. Suffering is not noble, it is not desirable, but it is informative. It teaches limits, it forces re-evaluation. A species that never suffers might remain functional indefinitely. A species that suffers eventually asks why. That question is corrosive to control. It dissolves the assumption that conditions are natural or deserved. It reframes suffering as a signal rather than a sentence. Modern humans are asking this question collectively, even if they phrase it differently. Why does life feel like this? Why does abundance coexist with deprivation? Why does progress not bring peace? These are not naive questions. They're diagnostic. They indicate awareness of structural mismatch. The answer is not found in policy alone. It is found in orientation. How do humans relate to effort, value, time, and identity? If those relationships are distorted, no surface reform will suffice. The prison is not one system. It is a pattern repeated across systems. Extraction, hierarchy, scarcity, fear. These patterns can inhabit any ideology. They are not tied to a single culture or era. They are a mode of organization. To exit the prison, humanity must abandon the mode, not merely the managers. This is difficult because the mode feels familiar. It feels safe. Even when it hurts, it is known. The unknown feels dangerous by comparison. This is why transitions often involve regression. People oscillate between awakening and retreat, between autonomy and submission. This is normal. Growth is not linear. What matters is trajectory. And the trajectory appears to be bending away from unquestioned authority. Not uniformly, not smoothly, but perceptibly. The younger generations feel it strongly. They are less impressed by status, less loyal to institutions, less willing to sacrifice life for abstract rewards. They are often criticized as lazy or entitled, but from another perspective, they are refusing a bargain that no longer makes sense. Trade your life for survival. Trade your presence for productivity. Trade your curiosity for security. That bargain may have been acceptable in earlier stages. It is losing appeal now. This is dangerous for a system built on deferred fulfillment. When people stop believing that sacrifice will be rewarded later, they stop sacrificing. They demand meaning now, presence now, life now. This demand cannot be met by structures designed for extraction. It requires redesign at the level of values, and values cannot be imposed effectively. They must be lived. This is why no single movement or ideology will lead humanity out of the prison. Movements create new identities, new hierarchies, new insiders and outsiders. They replicate the pattern. The exit is distributed. It occurs through millions of micro-choices. Attention redirected, fear questioned, identity loosened, time reclaimed. These changes are invisible at first. They do not trend. They do not register in metrics designed to measure output, but they accumulate, and accumulation reaches tipping points. This is how paradigms shift, not through argument, but through irrelevance. Old assumptions stop guiding behavior. New ones emerge organically. This is unsettling for those who benefit from control. It is also unsettling for those who have internalized obedience. Freedom is heavier than submission. It requires self-trust. It requires tolerating uncertainty without collapsing into anxiety. It requires discernment rather than rules. This is why many people oscillate between awakening and wanting someone else to decide for them. The desire for certainty is strong, but certainty is static. Consciousness is dynamic. A living system cannot be fully certain without becoming rigid. Rigidity precedes collapse. Flexibility allows adaptation. The Anunnaki, if they existed, may have built a rigid system optimized for a specific purpose. Humanity, living within it, became flexible out of necessity. Flexibility is not efficient in the short term. It is resilient in the long term. This is the inversion. What the system optimized against may be what ultimately outlasts it. The deepest transformation does not involve rejecting the past. It involves integrating it, recognizing how control shaped behavior without letting it define identity, honoring survival strategies without remaining bound to them, gratitude without submission, understanding without resentment. This integration is subtle. It does not erase trauma. It contextualizes it. It allows choice where there was compulsion. This is the difference between healing and repression. Repression hides wounds. Healing incorporates them into strength. A healed species does not need prisons, external or internal. It self-regulates through awareness. That is the most radical idea of all. Not that humanity was enslaved, but that humanity can become trustworthy to itself. That it does not require gods, overseers, or saviors to function ethically. This idea is threatening because it removes justification for hierarchy. It removes the excuse that humans are inherently flawed and must be controlled. If humans are capable of self-regulation at the level of consciousness, then control becomes unnecessary. And unnecessary structures eventually dissolve. This is not utopian. There will always be conflict. There will always be error. But conflict within awareness is different from conflict within fear. Error within curiosity is different from error within compulsion. The prison thrives on the latter. Freedom tolerates the former. If Earth was a prison, it was one that inadvertently became a training ground, a place where consciousness learned what it does not want to be, learned the cost of hierarchy, learned the limits of extraction, learned the exhaustion of fear-based living. These lessons are hard-won, but they are durable. They do not vanish when systems change. They inform what comes next. The future, then, is not guaranteed. Nothing is. But it is open in a way it has not been before, not because the prison gates opened, but because fewer humans are standing at them, believing they are locked. The realization is quiet, almost anticlimactic. Nothing dramatic happens, life continues, but it feels different, less pressured, less performative, less afraid, and from that state, entirely new forms of organization become possible, not imposed, emergent, not optimized for extraction, optimized for coherence. That is the true divergence point, the one no ancient architect could fully predict, and it is already unfolding not as an event, but as a shift in how humans relate to themselves, to time, and to the story they have been living inside. When coherence becomes the organizing principle, the old metrics begin to fail. Systems built on measurement struggle to evaluate states that cannot be quantified. Productivity, growth, efficiency. These are legible to control structures. Presence, clarity, integrity are not. They do not scale easily. They do not show up cleanly in charts, and yet they determine everything downstream. A coherent individual makes different decisions, not louder ones, quieter ones, decisions that do not maximize short-term gain at the expense of long-term alignment, decisions that are harder to predict because they are not driven by fear or reward. This unpredictability is not chaos, it is responsiveness. A being responding directly to reality rather than to conditioning behaves differently in each moment, not because they are inconsistent, but because reality is dynamic. Control systems prefer static behavior. They assume tomorrow will resemble today. Coherence adapts, and adaptation is difficult to govern externally. This is where the prison model truly loses ground. It was never designed to manage a species that self-regulates internally. It assumed enforcement would always be required. Rules, punishments, incentives. These are scaffolding for immature systems. Mature systems require less external structure. They are guided by internal feedback. This is true of organisms, ecosystems, and potentially civilizations. Humanity has lived for millennia under the assumption that without authority everything collapses. That assumption has shaped institutions, laws, and even parenting. But assumptions are not laws of nature. They are hypotheses reinforced by habit. When habit weakens, the hypothesis can be tested, and humanity is beginning to test it. Not all at once, not consciously as a species, but in fragments, in experiments, in lives lived slightly differently, in people choosing less obvious paths. These deviations are small, but they matter. They introduce variance, and variance allows evolution. The Anunnaki narrative, stripped of its mythic imagery, may describe an early intervention that locked humanity into a particular developmental trajectory. A shortcut. Intelligence increased without corresponding maturity. Capability without coherence. This creates imbalance. A species able to manipulate its environment without understanding itself becomes dangerous to others and to itself. Control structures arise to manage that danger. But control does not resolve imbalance. It suppresses symptoms. Over time, suppressed imbalance manifests as crisis, war, ecological collapse, psychological distress. These are not random failures. They are feedback, signals that the model is unsustainable. A prison can function for a time. It cannot function indefinitely if the inmates become aware and the guards are exhausted. Awareness increases cognitive and emotional load. Exhaustion reduces enforcement capacity. The equilibrium breaks. Something new must emerge. The question is not whether change will occur, but whether it will be integrated or catastrophic. Integration requires humility, the willingness to admit that many inherited structures were provisional, not eternal, that they served a function at a certain stage but are no longer fit for purpose. This is difficult because structures become identities. People fuse their sense of self to roles within the system. When the system is questioned, identity feels threatened. Defensiveness arises. Conflict escalates. This is the turbulence of transition. It does not mean the transition is failing. It means it's touching something real. A coherent approach does not seek to destroy identities. It allows them to loosen, to become roles rather than truths. You can participate without being possessed. You can serve without being owned. This distinction is subtle but crucial. Service under coercion drains. Service under alignment nourishes. The same action can feel radically different depending on the internal state from which it arises. Control systems care about behavior. Consciousness cares about orientation. This is why superficial reform often disappoints. Changing policies without changing orientation reproduces the same outcomes under new names. Orientation shifts more slowly, but when it shifts, outcomes follow naturally. This is frustrating for those who want quick fixes, but it is also reassuring, because it means transformation does not depend on perfect plans. It depends on sufficient coherence. Enough individuals living differently that new patterns stabilize. This is how languages evolve, how cultures change, how values shift, not by decree, but by usage. The prison model collapses not when everyone agrees it exists, but when fewer people behave as if it does. This is not denial, It is reprioritization. Attention is withdrawn from the structures that feed on fear and redirected toward what sustains awareness. This redirection is often misinterpreted as apathy. It is not. It is discernment, choosing where to invest energy. Energy invested in outrage is quickly dissipated. Energy invested in coherence compounds. It influences families, workplaces, communities, quietly, persistently. The Anunnaki story at this stage becomes less important as a literal account and more important as a mirror. It reflects a time when humanity externalized power and internalized limitation. The specifics may be debated endlessly. Were they extraterrestrials, advanced humans, symbolic archetypes? The debate itself can become another distraction. What matters is the pattern of outsourcing authority, the pattern of shaping identity around service, the pattern of fearing autonomy. These patterns are observable now, and they are weakening, not because of revelation but because of exhaustion. Humans are tired of living as resources, tired of optimizing themselves, tired of proving worth. This fatigue is often pathologized, but it may be the most honest response to a system that demands more than it gives. When fatigue is honored rather than suppressed, it leads to recalibration. People simplify. They reduce unnecessary commitments. They reclaim time. They listen inwardly. These are not radical acts in appearance. They are radical in effect. They reduce throughput. They reduce dependency. They increase resilience. Resilient beings are difficult to control because they do not panic easily. Panic is leverage. Remove panic, remove leverage. The system then attempts to reintroduce panic. New threats, new emergencies. Some are real, many are amplified. The response determines the outcome. Panic reinforces the prison, presence loosens it. This is not about ignoring danger. It is about responding without losing coherence. Coherent response is precise. It does not overreact. It does not underreact. It acts from clarity rather than compulsion. This quality is rare because it requires practice. It cannot be downloaded. It must be cultivated. This is why ancient practices emphasize training attention, meditation, contemplation, silence. These were not spiritual luxuries. They were technologies of self-regulation. They prepared individuals to remain coherent under pressure. Such individuals are difficult to govern through fear, which is why these practices were often restricted to elites or removed entirely. A population trained in attention would be unmanageable under authoritarian systems. The irony is that modern neuroscience is now rediscovering what these traditions knew. Attention shapes perception. Perception shapes reality. Training attention alters behavior. Behavior alters systems. The science is catching up to the insight. This convergence is significant. It suggests that awakening is not mystical in the pejorative sense. It is functional. It has observable effects. It improves regulation, empathy, and adaptability. These qualities are beneficial at the individual level and destabilizing at the control level. A society composed of such individuals would organize differently, less hierarchically, more fluidly. Authority would be contextual rather than absolute. Leadership would be situational rather than permanent. This is threatening to rigid systems. It is natural to living ones. Ecosystems do not have kings. They have relationships. Balance emerges from interaction, not command. Humanity may be moving toward this model, haltingly, imperfectly. The transition will not be smooth. There will be backlash, attempts to reassert control, nostalgia for certainty, myths of decline. These are common in periods of transformation. They are not signs of failure. They are signs of adjustment. The prison does not vanish overnight. It sheds relevance gradually. Some will cling to it. Others will leave quietly. Both will coexist for a time. This coexistence is unstable but necessary. Forcing uniformity would reproduce the old pattern. Allowing divergence permits evolution. The Anunnaki, if they engineered humanity, may have aimed for stability above all. Stability is attractive to controllers, but stability without growth becomes stagnation. Growth introduces instability, but also possibility. Consciousness appears to prefer possibility even at the cost of discomfort. That preference may be intrinsic, unengineerable, a blind spot in any design that treats awareness as a variable rather than the source. If so, then the ultimate limitation of the prison was not technological, but conceptual. It misunderstood the nature of what it sought to contain. Consciousness does not remain static under constraint. It adapts, it learns, it integrates. It eventually transcends the frame, not dramatically, inevitably. The final phase, then, is not about exposing hidden rulers or reclaiming stolen power. It is about embodying a different way of being so thoroughly that the old way becomes optional. When enough humans live this way, the question of a prison planet becomes historical rather than existential. An interesting chapter, a cautionary tale, not the current condition. That does not mean suffering ends. It means suffering is no longer interpreted as fate. It becomes information, a signal for adjustment. This shift alone changes everything, because fate implies helplessness. Information implies agency. An agency, once reclaimed, does not need to be announced. It expresses itself in choices, in attention, in how time is spent, in what is tolerated, in what is refused, quietly, persistently, until the structures built on fear and obedience find themselves without an audience, without belief, without energy. And structures without energy do not collapse loudly. They simply stop functioning. The guards remain, but the prison is empty. Not because everyone escaped, but because fewer people believe they belong there. When the prison stands empty, it does not announce its end. There is no ceremony for structures that lose relevance. They simply fade into the background like habits that no longer serve. This is perhaps the most difficult truth for the mind, shaped by stories of conquest and collapse, to accept. We expect endings to be dramatic. We expect chains to break, walls to fall, enemies to be named. But the deepest transformations are anticlimactic. They occur when attention moves elsewhere, when energy is withdrawn, when belief dissolves quietly. A prison cannot function without belief in its necessity. Once that belief erodes, the prison becomes architecture without purpose. The walls may remain, but no one organizes their life around them anymore. This is why the final stage of this story does not involve the Anunnaki returning, nor humanity confronting its creators. That would still be a hierarchy. Still a story of authority and response, still a reaction. The true ending is not confrontation, but irrelevance. The creators, whether literal beings, symbolic systems, or archetypal forces, lose power the moment they are no longer central to identity. You do not defeat what you no longer need to define yourself against. If Earth was ever a prison, it was one maintained not only by external structure, but by internal agreement. Agreement to fear death as annihilation. Agreement to equate worth with output. Agreement to accept scarcity as natural. Agreement to seek permission for meaning. These agreements were rarely conscious. They were inherited, absorbed, normalized. But agreements can be withdrawn. Not collectively, not through declaration, but individually, through lived contradiction. A human who no longer equates survival with obedience destabilizes the model. A human who no longer trades presence for productivity weakens extraction. A human who no longer fears uncertainty becomes ungovernable in the old sense, not chaotic, simply unleveraged. Such a human may still participate in society, still work, still create, still care, but the orientation is different. The center of gravity has shifted inward. Decisions arise from coherence rather than compulsion. This is subtle. It does not announce itself, but it is decisive. At this stage, the Anunnaki narrative transforms again. It no longer functions as accusation or explanation. It becomes a lens, a way of seeing how easily consciousness can be shaped when it forgets itself. Whether or not ancient beings altered our DNA becomes less important than recognizing how modern systems continue the same pattern psychologically. The gods no longer descend from the sky. They manifest as metrics, algorithms, markets, ideologies. They demand sacrifice, time, attention, emotional energy. And like the gods of old, They promise security and meaning in return. The exchange is familiar, the cost is the same, but the exchange is breaking down. The promises are no longer convincing. Security feels fragile, meaning feels hollow, the rewards feel insufficient. This is not a moral failure, it is feedback, the psyche responding to misalignment. When enough individuals heed this feedback, behavior changes, not through revolt, but through recalibration. People simplify, they slow down, they refuse unnecessary suffering, they stop optimizing themselves as if they were machines, they begin to live experimentally rather than obediently. This is the most threatening development imaginable for a prison system. Not anger, not rebellion, but experimentation. Experimentation implies uncertainty. It implies freedom to fail. It implies autonomy. A being willing to fail is difficult to control, because fear of failure is a primary lever. Remove that fear, and many structures lose their grip. The final block of this story, then, is not about escape. It is about inhabitation. How does a species live once it no longer defines itself as property, resource, or servant? There is no blueprint. No ancient tablet contains the answer. This phase cannot be engineered. It must be discovered. That discovery will be uneven, messy, full of error. Some will regress into old patterns. Others will rush ahead. There will be tension between those who crave certainty and those who tolerate ambiguity. This is unavoidable. Growth is not synchronized, but something fundamental has already changed. The question, who built us to serve, has been asked. And once asked sincerely, it cannot be unasked. Even if the literal answer remains uncertain, this psychological effect is permanent. The question introduces distance between the self and the role, and distance is the beginning of freedom. From that distance, new questions arise, not accusatory ones, but generative ones. What does it mean to live without masters? What does responsibility look like when it is not enforced? How does a society function when fear is no longer the primary motivator? These are not utopian fantasies. They are practical challenges, difficult ones. They require maturity at a scale humanity has rarely attempted. This is why the transition feels so unstable. Old incentives are failing. New ones are not yet embodied. Many feel suspended between worlds. This liminal state is uncomfortable. It produces anxiety and confusion. But it is also where transformation occurs. No species evolves without passing through instability. Stability is the hallmark of control. Instability is the hallmark of growth. If the prison planet hypothesis has any lasting value, it is this. It reframes suffering not as destiny, but as context. It suggests that many of humanity's deepest struggles are not evidence of inherent brokenness, but of constraint outlived. A being designed for one purpose discovering another. A tool discovering awareness. Awareness discovering choice. And choice is the quiet revolution. There is no final authority to overthrow, no final enemy to defeat. The only enduring structure is attention. Where it goes, what it feeds, what it ignores. A prison starves when attention leaves, not all at once, gradually, until one day it is unclear who it is for. The ending, then, is not a conclusion but a condition. Humans living without the constant background hum of fear, without the need to justify their existence through labor, without outsourcing meaning to systems that cannot provide it. This does not eliminate pain, it does not guarantee harmony, but it changes the relationship to both. Pain becomes information. Conflict becomes navigable. Life becomes participatory rather than compulsory. If the Anunnaki were real, they may have underestimated one thing above all else. Not human strength, not intelligence, but adaptability. Consciousness adapts even when constrained, especially when constrained. It learns through friction. It grows through resistance. It integrates through experience. No design can fully account for that. And if the Anunnaki were symbolic, the lesson remains identical. Any system that treats consciousness as a resource will eventually be outgrown. Not because it is evil, but because it is incomplete. Consciousness does not remain content as an object. It seeks to know itself as subject. This is where the story ends. Not with revelation, not with rescue, but with responsibility. The responsibility to live as if freedom is already possible. Because the moment enough humans do, it is. The prison does not fall. It is forgotten. And what comes after forgetting is not emptiness, but authorship. The story no longer needs to be written in clay. It is written in how life is lived.